In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make one of these actually quite simple Biscornu pouches. You may have seen these kind of things before as pin cushions or as cushions with a button in the centre, but this is a zippered pouch which is fully lined with no raw edges showing on the inside, that you can make in any size that you like. So the larger one I have here is made with a 10-inch square template, and the smaller one is an 8.5 inch, but you can make these 5 inches, 12 inches, whatever size that you like. And I think they're going to be quite handy for storage, so somewhere to keep your sewing notions, maybe your clips, spare bobbins and things like that. Makeup, cosmetics, absolutely perfect. Organising yourself in the bathroom, so maybe these could be your cotton wool wipes and things like that. And they make a great gift idea as well. And when somebody realises that you've made this yourself, they're going to wonder how on earth you did it, because it looks an awful lot more complicated than it is. But these, as I said, are just using 10-inch squares, so that's where we're going to start. I need 2 10-inch squares of one fabric and 2 10-inch squares of a second fabric, and then decide which fabric you want to go on the top. So I'm going to have my sunglasses on the top where the butterfly's on here, so that's the section that's going to be zippered, and then I've got the contrast, which in this case is going to be my yellow underneath. So with one part of the fabric, I've cut that in half, that's where the zip's going to go, and I'll need to do that with both pieces. Now on the outer part of the bag, so in other words where the zip's going to go with my sunglasses fabric, I've put some fusible fleece on the wrong side. So this is Vileselene H640. You will need some kind of interfacing or stabiliser, otherwise your bag's just going to flop flat. It won't actually keep its shape. So H640 for me is a perfect weight of interfacing. So that goes on to the outer sections. So on the top that's going to be the section with the zip, and on the bottom that's going to be the full square. So the 2 smaller pieces don't have the interfacing. So all these are basically is your 10-inch square cut in half, like so. So that was the start of my 4 squares, which is all that's needed. What I'm also going to do is to pop a little bit of ribbon this time around the end of the zip to form loop, so you've got something to hold on to. Now my zip I've already cut down to 8 inches in length, and that's going to go in between these pieces. I don't have the zip going all the way to the ends of the fabric. This is going to go in here because I don't want to be sewing the ends of the zip into a seam. So I'm going to add a little bit of fabric each end of the zip to just make it the right length. Now my little scraps of fabric are a little bit too big, but I find it easier to do that and then cut them down to size. So these measure about 2 inches by 2.5 inches. They don't have to be perfect. Then I have my little pieces of ribbon, which are going to be the first things that we put on. So let's just move that out of the way for now. And these are about 2 inches long, and I'm just going to fold them in half and sew them to each end of the zip, like so. You may find it easier to use something like a fabric glue pen, just to hold everything in place as you sew, or you could pin it. That's entirely up to you. So that goes on the end there. You may find it easier to use just a little dot of glue on the open end of the zip, just to hold it in place and keep it closed as you sew. So a bit more glue on there, and again facing inwards just over the end there. And then we'll just sew across these 2 sides within the seam allowance, so quite close to the edge. Then my little tabs of fabric are going to go on, and again these are cut too big. I find with smaller pieces of fabric like this, it's normally easier for me to cut them a little bit too big and then trim them down to the exact size, rather than trying to work with very small pieces of fabric that are already cut to the exact size. So let's bit of glue on the end, and that's going to go right sides together facing down. And then I'll need to put the second piece of fabric just on the other side, again facing down, and so, and I'm using about 1/4 inch seam allowance. So we have this. And then let's do the same on this side. So again, you don't have to use the glue. Don't go rushing out and buying any if you don't have any, but it does actually come in very handy. It's like pins in a stick. Remember to put your lid on because it does dry quite quickly. And then we'll sew. And again, we'll trim this down to size later on. And I'll just finger press that back again. Then I'm going to sew this in between the two outer pieces. So this is going to be right sides together. So let's fold this over. I like to sew from the zip side so I can see exactly where I'm sewing along the zip tape. And let's position the zip just in the center here. So you should have about an inch or so, maybe a little bit less, each side. So I can hold that with a couple of pins for now. Just so I know it's in the right position. And then we'll sew. So I'm lining up again the edge of the zip with the edge of the fabric. And sew straight down the center of the zip tape. Now you may notice I haven't got the zipper foot on my sewing machine. My sewing machine's got such a wide foot, it actually doesn't need the zipper foot for a lot of zips. But if you prefer, then of course you put your zipper foot on. Experiment, because this has got such a big foot, it glides very nicely over the top of a zip without having to change a foot, which actually makes it quite easy if you're sewing things with a lot of zips in. I'm just trying to move the slider out of the way, and I've got the needle down so I'm not losing the position of my stitches. Now when it comes up to the ribbon, I've actually moved it out of the way to one side. It is important that you don't sew the ribbon into the zip. So don't choose a ribbon that's going to be too wide. You don't want to put a ribbon the same width as the zip. So when I fold that over, the ribbon is actually loose. That's what I want. So that's the zip sewn into one side. Let's do the same on the opposite side. So again, right sides together. Move the ribbon out of the way. Line up the edge of the zip with the edge of the fabric and the top ends of the fabric here, so they sit evenly to each side. And then sew down the opposite side of the zip. So when you come to the slider, you're going to lift the zip, the presser foot right out of the way, move the slider while you're leaving the needle down, and sew right down to the opposite end. And again, I'm just going to move that ribbon out of the way as we sew. So that's the outside. Now we need to put the lining on, and you can see how these tabs are too long. I can trim those back down to size now. That's what I was saying about just finding it a little bit easier to have your fabric in that case too long and trim it back, because here you see I would be working with very small pieces of fabric, which could be a little bit tricky. But you'll find your own way to do that. So now we need to put the lining on the opposite sides. And I do prefer to do this in two stages like this. I know you can sandwich the whole thing together in one, and sew both the lining and the outer fabric around the zip all at the same time. But I like to see where I'm going, because if I've got two pieces of fabric each side of the zip, I can't see where the zip is, so I don't know exactly where along that zip tape I'm sewing. So I know that if I now sew on the wrong side, or on the side that I've just sewn, I should say, that's my stitch line, so I know exactly where I'm going to sew. So again, let's just move the ribbon to one side so I make sure I'm not sewing over the end of that, and just go down the edge. So directly over the top of the stitches that you've sewn, or slightly to the right hand side if that's easier. Up with the slider. And all the way down to the end. And I'll just make sure again that I haven't caught that ribbon in the lining. So that's the lining on the one side. Now we need to sew the second piece of lining onto the opposite side of the zip. So right sides together with the zip. I like to sew from this side that I've just sewn. Line up the edges so I can see the stitches that I've just sewn, and we'll go over exactly the same marks. And again, when you come to the slider, I went straight over it on the last one. You can feel the lump, mine's here. So stop with the needle down, foot right up, fiddle around under here till you find it, move it out of the way, and carry on sewing. And just check again that you haven't caught the ribbon in the seam. If you have, it's not the end of the world, then you can just unpick that and re-sew the seam. Just got a loose thread here. Then I'm going to press around the zip. And then we'll top stitch all around here as well. Now I have some 505 spray, which is a basting spray, a repositionable spray. So I'll just move my machine out of the way. And I'm just going to baste these two pieces together. You don't have to, so again, don't rush out and buy glue if you don't have any. Spray away from your sewing machine. But all I'm going to do here is to simply give 1/2 a spray and then hold it together like so. If you don't have or don't want to use a basting spray, then it may be an idea to just do a tacking stitch or a basting stitch all the way around the side, just to hold these pieces together before we start to construct the bag. Let's fold that over. And that just helps to keep everything in place. A basting spray, like 505 that I use, disappears after a couple of days, so it's not going to stay in your work. It'll certainly wash out as well, but it's a temporary basting spray. So it's great for quilting and things like that as well, but for little bits like this, it's perfect. Okay, then I'm going to stitch all the way around the edge of the zip. So I can lengthen the stitch now because it's not a seam. And just sew all the way around. And this, I think, looks nice, but it also helps to keep the lining away from the zip. It stops it from moving. So I'm going to leave the ribbon pointing inwards. And if you've noticed, it doesn't stand out too much on this fabric, but I've actually got these facing in opposite directions. So just before you leave me a message to say you've got one of those upside down, I know. I could say it was deliberate. Move the slider out of the way. Down to the bottom. So when I come to the bottom here, my little ribbon is facing towards the zip. So that's my zip panel finished. So let's start putting this together. The first thing I'm going to do is to mark the center of each side. I know where the center is here because it's in the middle of the zip. You can see my lining's moved a little bit. That can happen. I'm just going to trim that back down to size. So I'm going to fold this in half and just make a little snip into the side. Now I'm using about 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, so I don't want to make this snip any larger than 1/4 of an inch, otherwise I'll be cutting into where I'm sewing. And then I'll need to do the same with the opposite side. So this is the outer piece, the contrast outer piece with the H640, but on all 4 sides in this case. So again, you could mark this with an erasable ink pen if you prefer. I can see these snips very clearly, which is why I like to do it this way. There we go, those out of the way. And we'll also need to do the same with the final lining piece. So again, just tiny snip into the centre of each side. So open it out this way and do the same again, because this is where our points are going to match. Okay, that can go to one side. So now we're going to sew the back panel to the bag. So this is the top of the bag, this is my back panel. But instead of sewing square to square like this, we're going to sew this way, which is what gives the bag its quirky shape. Biscornu is French for quirky, by the way, if you weren't aware. So I'm going to line up, let's start where one of the snips is. Don't line up the edge of the fabric to the snip. You'll need to overlap it by your seam allowance. So if I just mark that with a pen, my seam allowance is going to be about 1/4 of an inch, which is here. So I need to line this spot up with the mark or the snip that I've made here, like so. Okay, I'm going to put a pin in this just to show you where I'm sewing. I don't normally pin when I'm sewing this. I find it easier not to. So I'm going to sew here right up to the second side. Now I've got my snip in the corner here, which will be 1/4 of an inch from the end of here. So I need to sew up to the snip, not to the end of that fabric. And then I'm going to turn all of this around and carry on sewing to the next part here. So here we go. So remember, not right from the edge, but from 1/4 of an inch in. And sew down to the snip. And stop with the needle down. Then we're going to turn this around, so I'm pulling the bottom fabric around and lining the edges up here. And you can see where the centre of my fabric is here, that's overlapping by 1/4 of an inch. So just like before, we're going to stop 1/4 of an inch before the edge. You don't need to mark that every single time, that's just so that I can show you what I'm doing. So again, stop with the needle down, lift the foot up, turn this around. Make sure you don't have any little puckers and creases. Line up the edge and sew down to the next point. So again, there's my little snip, and when I stop sewing, that will be 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the fabric underneath. And you do this all the way around. So 1/4 of an inch before the end, turn around and carry on. You can start to see the shape of the bag coming through now. So this may seem a little bit knotty and a little bit fiddly, but we're just concentrating on the seam in hand. So if this starts to feel a little bit bulky, then completely ignore it, don't worry about that. Let's turn this around and carry on. And remember to be sewing and you go all the way around. Maybe an idea to just double check that the zip's open at this point. Again, it's not too difficult to undo it if it's not, but it's a lot easier if it is. So just coming down the final side, just line that up. And you can really see the shape of the bag now. Just going to open that a little bit more. So now we need to put in the lining. Okay. And hopefully I explain this okay. The lining needs to go right sides together with its opposite, which is back here. So the zip section is in the centre. So in other words, right sides together, that goes over the top like that. And we need to sew all the way around the edge. Now just take a look at the back piece here with the fleece on and figure out which were the snipped sides and which were the corners. There's a corner and there's a snip. So when I sew these together, I want to make sure that it goes with the corner and with a snip. So that's how I'm going to sew mine. I'm going to start at the corner here, because if you start to sew like this, so in other words, that's a snipped bit, so that's in the middle of the fabric, and that's the corner, you'll find it gets really knotty and it won't work. They have to match. So flatten that out, find the snip, my snip's here, and it's snipped, snip to snip, if that makes sense. And again, we'll sew all the way around. This time we will need to leave a turning gap. So we're starting overlapping that end again, just like we did before. And so when I come up to my snip, again, just like we did previously, but it does get a little bit more tricky. When I come to my snip, I'm going to stop there. Needle down, turn around. And again, concentrate on where you're actually sewing, not what's going on here. Because this will start to feel quite messy, and I'm sure if this is your first one, you're going to be thinking this just isn't working. It's just getting in a big knot. But persevere. There's always your quick unpick if it doesn't work the first time. So just keep lining them up, just like we did before. It actually comes together quite quickly when you think about it. And it is a clever design, if I say so myself, because you're only using 4 squares of fabric. And I do like things that look complicated, particularly if you are selling anything that you're making, because it really looks like, you know, it's taken you a long time to make something like this. It does look very complicated. But after you've made your first one, sure there'll be many more. So again, I'm still going around just like I did before. Let's pull out that straight edge. This doesn't look right, but it'll be fine, promise. Smooth that out so I'm not making any puckers, keeping the seam nice and straight. Now I'm going to leave my turning gap here. So I'm going to stop sewing, move my machine along just by maybe 2 or 3 inches. The smaller the gap you leave, the less hand sewing you'll need to do when you close the opening later. Just a few more sides to go. Whoops, well, the needle didn't stay down there. There we go. Important that you leave the needle down, because you'll never pick up the stitch line if you lift the needle up. So into the corner again. Stop at the snip. Here's my final side. just back down to where I came. Right, now let's turn the whole thing the right side out. So where was that gap that I left? There we go. That's a very small hole, but again, the smaller the hole, the less hand stitching you're going to need to do. If some of those stitches crack a little bit, then it really doesn't matter. We'll just have a larger hole to sew through. So very gently, let's just tease out the bag. And I'm saying a smaller hole takes less time to sew up, but a smaller hole takes a longer time to pull it through, so maybe a larger hole would have been better. So just keep going with this. When you do pull it through, it'll still be inside out. That'll make sense in a minute. And then we will need to hand sew the opening closed, but you don't really see the stitches on the inside, so if you don't like hand sewing, it doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. So this is obviously going to be very creased when I pulled it through, because that was a tiny hole. Just that last little bit. There. So again, I've got a gap there which I'll need to sew over. So I'm just going to take my hand needle and thread, not in the bottom, and let's sew the opening closed. And I'm just going to use maybe a slip stitch. If you want this to be completely invisible, then a ladder stitch would be the best one to go for. But a slip stitch is really quick. You just go over the edge. And I'm only catching the seam allowance. I'm not going all the way through to the outside of the bag because you will see the stitches. This is why you can't machine sew this one closed. It has to be a hand stitch, I'm afraid, for this one. I say that, I say I'm afraid, but because my daughter hates hand sewing. I actually love it. I take great satisfaction from making tiny little invisible stitches on things like this, even in areas that you don't see, like the inside of the lining. Okay, that will do. Just knock that off. Snip off the thread. I see a thread going over the zip there, which needs to go. So this is why we needed to leave the zip open, because now we can turn the whole thing the right side out and push out all of those points that you just made. Now we're going to give it a quick press, and I like to press along the seams just to make them nice and crisp. If you have some spray starch or something like Best Press, then that can help to keep the seams nice and crisp. It smells nice as well. So I'm just going to fold over the seam so the seam's right on the edge of the bag, and just press along here. And it does make a difference. It makes a very sharp finish to your seams and really makes this unusual design stand out. So that's my little bag finished. Turn my iron off. And I think it's really fun. As you can see, it doesn't actually take too long to make it. When you kind of understand the way that it works and the way that it goes together, it is actually a very simple bag. But it's different, it's unusual. It looks like a challenge, but it's really not. And remember, you can make these in any kind of fabrics and any size that you like as well. So experiment, make them smaller, make them bigger, have a whole collection of different sizes of them, but have fun making them. So I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial. I hope you make lots and lots of them, and I hope you sell them, and I hope you give them away, and I hope you enjoy every minute of making them as well. I shall see you again next time.